Welcome to LabMinutes.com. You might be familiar with the lobby ambassador concept on the wireless LAN controller, where you assign a person, usually the receptionist, to hand out guest login accounts. The concept of guests on Cisco ISE is slightly different. You can now have multiple personnel creating guest account, and each of them can be responsible for their own guests. This allows them to, for example, create a guest account a day in advance and send that to their guests before they come on site. If you want to give your guests even more freedom, you can allow them to create their own account through a self-service portal. So in this video, we will look at guest sponsor and guest login on Cisco ISE. Here's our lab setup. So here we have a Cisco ISE running version 112 at the IP of .102 and a domain controller at the IP of .40. So here our scenario is going to be, we have two guests that's going to be on site, bring in his computer, try to connect to wired and wireless network. So for our first guest, John Doe, we're going to have our user admin1 is AD user, who is also a member of guest sponsor AD user groups, creating an account for him. And for our second guest, Jen Doe, we're going to allow her to perform self-service to create her own account. Okay, so let's start off by looking at our configuration on AD. So here we have a user admin1 who's going to be our sponsor, and he is a member of guest sponsor user group. Okay, and on the wireless LAN controller, we have created a dedicated guest SSID called LM-guests. And if you look under the configuration, we have it mapped to VLAN 64, which is our user VLAN. Layer 2 security, we have it set to none, but we want to do a wireless map, so we have map filtering enabled. And on the AAA server, we have it point to ISE for both authentication and accounting servers. On the advanced tab, we have allow AAA override enable check, and on the NAC state we have it set to radius NAC, which is just a regular config for SSID that you normally use with ISE. And we have DSCP assignment required, DSCP profiling, and we have the default ACL or interface ACL set to LM ISE only, which allows the user to only communicate with ISE. Okay, now if we go to the configuration on ISE, the first thing we want to make sure is we have the guest sponsor AD user group added. So here we go to the Active Directory, make sure it's connected. Then hop to groups, add, select group from the Active Directory, filter, we know it's the username or the group name starts with guest. Retrieve, here we have our guest sponsor, click OK, and then save. Now the majority of the configuration is going to be under Web Portal Management and Settings. So we kind of step through this particular page quickly back in the introduction to ISE interface, but now we're going to go into a little bit more details for the configuration that's related to our guest login process. So here let's start off with General. Here we have the portal theme where you can customize with all the basic settings such as backgrounds and text colors. But for now, let's leave this a default. We'll come back and revisit this a little bit later on this video. Next, we look at the ports. These are the default ports that the guest portal use. So right here, guest portal by default use 8443, and you can change that to whatever number you like. And for the sponsor portal page, also using 8443 for the port, and you can even create like a friendly URL. For example, guest or sponsor.yourdomain.com. By doing this, and you just need to make sure you have a corresponding DNS entry for that. But let's try, if you want to do sponsor.labminutes.com and trying to save, you see it prompts you that you need to restart your server. So let's not do that at this point, but just keep that in mind. Anytime you changed or configured the friendly URL for sponsor, even my device portal page, you will need a service restart. Okay, so leave everything at default. Now let's go to the sponsor. And for our authentication source for sponsor, we want to use the admin one that's located in AD. So by default, it's sponsor portal sequence, which is pointing to the internal users or local database. But here we want to point to AD. So go to LM AD local and then save. Okay, next we move down to the guest directory here. You can start off with the default policy. And here are the different information that you can gather or enter for guests. So right now all of these attributes are set to optional. So let's say we might want the first name to be mandatory, as well as last name, company, and email. We can leave phone number optionals, and you can see all these optional data that you can pretty much customize to whatever you like. If in case you want to gather a little bit more information from your guest, and let's save that for now. And the way to change these labels for each of these attributes to go to the language template. And since we're dealing with English, so click English, and if you scroll down, you can see you can pretty much customize the wordings. So login page, I think what we need is self-registration. Let's see if we can locate that. Oh, there you go, right here. Optional data. So if you want to change that, as you can see first name, last name, email, phone number, company, and here it allows you to change the label for the optional data. Okay, we're not going to change that, so let's leave that at default. Now move down a little bit, we got the multi-portal configuration, and by default it comes with one, but we're going to create a customized one ourselves, so click add, and let's call this one LM guest_portal, since it doesn't really allow you to put dashes. Okay, and then under operation, we want to present the acceptable use policy at first login. Let's say we want to use that for self-provisioning, although it's not relevant to what we're doing with guest login. But if you say want to share that same guest login for both your guest and your internal users for onboarding, then you want to have the self-provisioning flow check. Let's say we want the guest user to change the password. Again, this might not be applicable in your environment, but let's check that box and see what comes up. And we also want to allow self-service. So guest users should be allowed to do self-service. Customization template, we use English, a default. And then for authentication, here, let's just leave it as guest, which is local. So submit. Okay, so now it gives you a little information popped up and said, please make sure you select self-registration guest role and self-registration time profile, which we'll take care in a second here. So scroll down a little bit more. Here you got portal policy, and right here, this is where you set your self-registration guest role. So we want to put all the guests that come through self-registration under the group, user group guests. And the time profile will come back and adjust that in a second when we create that. Everything else we can leave at default as far as maximum lock-in failure, device portal limit, guest password expiration. So leave those default. For password policy, this is how complex you want your guest password gets, because it's going to be automatically generated for you when you create a guest account. So for now, let's leave it at default. You might want to modify this to suit your need. And let's move down to the time profile. Now time profile determines the duration of the guest account that you create. So right now the default, we got a couple 1 hours. These first login and default 1 hour, these are 1 hours. So let's create one ourselves. And let's say we want account to be good for a day. So call LM 1 day. Time zone, you select your respective time zone. For us, it's US Pacific. Let's see if we can look at that here. Account type, you can do account to start from creation. That's basically as soon as the account's being created. So when you click submit, the account will start ticking. Or you can start from the first login. So let's do the first login, and we say we want it to be 1 day. And you can even enforce the restrictions. And for example, if you do not want the account to work after business hours, for example. Okay, but for us, we're not gonna put any restriction on our account. So that's created. And the last thing we want to change is the username policy, and this is how you want the username to be generated. Okay, by default, it was just going to come up with a combination of what the user information is provided as far as the first name, last name, and some numbers. Okay, but for us, we're just going to make it easy, and let's use the username from the email, and then click Save. Now that we have the time profile set, we can go back quickly to the portal policy and set for the account that guests generate for themselves, we want them to only have or inherited the 1 day time profile that we created. So the account will be good for just 1 day. Okay, now that's just the generic settings. Now we can move on to the sponsor groups. So sponsor groups define what kind of privilege a sponsor will have. So here by default, these are some of the defaults that came with ISE. We're going to create our own, and we will call it LM sponsor all, because we want this particular sponsor to have a visibility to all the guest account that all the sponsors generate. And this is the authorization level that you can pick and choose and change. So you can see you can, for example, allow the import of the CSV if you want to create the guest account in bulk, whether they are capable of sending email or SMS, where they're able to see the guest password in clear text, and if they can, for example, suspend and reinstate accounts. So for now, let's leave all these at default, and let's look at guest role. And these are the user groups that the sponsor will be able to place guest under. So for us, we're going to use just the user group guest. And these are all the time profile that we're going to allow this particular sponsor to assign to the guest account that they create. So let's allow the particular sponsor to have all the access to all the options. Just come back real quick on the sponsor group page. There's a little option that says view edit accounts, and if you drop down the settings, you can pretty much prevent it from editing the accounts or what accounts do we have the visibility to. So by default is all account. You can create like group accounts, or if you just want the sponsor to view their own account, then you will set own account. So this is where the grouping or granularity of as far as who has the ability to manage whose accounts. Okay, so we'll leave it at all accounts. Click submit. Okay, now we move one tabs over to the group policy. So this is how you assign a sponsor groups to a sponsor. So again, ISE came with 3 default sponsor group policy rules here, which we do not want to use, but we're going to create one above. And let's call this one LM-sponsor. Identity group, since we're going to be using the AD group guest sponsor that we created, and that's going to reference to the create new condition, just like any other policies that we create on ISE. Equal external group, actually, drop down, and here's our guest sponsor. And given the user is a member of that particular AD group, we want them to have the LM sponsor all. Okay, for the other one, let's go ahead and disable that so we don't mistakenly get matched to those. Right, so that starts with the sponsor settings for the sponsor. Now we have to go back to the authentication policies and create the rules for guest login. We already have, since the user will be coming using the map authentication, we already have a wire map that's using the condition, the default condition of wire map, and then we allow all protocols with, if a user not found, let's continue. So that's a standard setting for map. We also need to create one for wireless since we'll be also testing wireless. So let's duplicate below and call this one WLAN map. Instead of wired, we go compound condition and wireless map. Everything else we can leave at default, which has got copied over from the one on top. Continue, just make sure, then we can save. Okay, now we're going to move over to authorization policy. But first we need to create conditions and results for that. So condition is going to be pretty simple. So we're just going to use the infill or inline configuration, but let's do the results. For authorization, start out with the downloadable ACL. So since we are going to allow users to have only access to ISE when they first connect to the network, so we create one called LM ISE only. And just make sure I avoid the typo. I'm going to copy and paste what I have. So permit DSCP DNS and then any traffic to ISE. Okay, submit. Next one is once they're successfully authenticated as guests, we want to allow access to internet only. So LM internet only. Again, let me copy and paste the ACL. And that's allow DSCP, DNS, any traffic to ISE still, and then deny everything else in the private IP space. So submit. Next we go to authorization profile. First we'll create one for wired, and this is going to be for redirecting users to the central web auth. So we'll click add, and we'll call it LM wired CWA with the downloadable ACL of ISE only, and web authentication with centralized, and we already have a redirect URL configured, and hopefully you guys are already familiar with the redirect URL at this point. So here on the switch, if you look at show access list with the ACL redirect that we have, so you can find that right here, we are not going to be redirecting DSCP, DNS, or traffic to ISE, but anything else that match the HTTP, HTTPS will be redirected to ISE. So basically it's just the reverse of what we have on configuring the ISE only ACL or the ACL. So have to make sure the name is the exact match. I'm going to copy that, paste, and the page that we'll be redirecting the user to is the one that we created previously, which is the LM guest portal. So submit. We have to create one more for wired when the user has successfully logged into the network, and we're going to call it LM, let's say wired internet only, and we will enforce the LM internet only downloadable ACL. Okay, make sure there's no typo, and then submit. Next we're going to create similar profiles for the wireless. So click add. This one is for the CWA wireless. So CWA, instead of using downloadable ACL, since the wireless controller doesn't use downloadable ACL, just going to do web authentication. And the one main difference with between the switch and the wireless LAN controller is this ACL right here. For the switch is the redirect ACL, but for the wireless LAN controller is actually the name ACL itself that we have configured in wireless. So if you hop onto the controller, access control list, we have one called LM ISE only. So you just copy the name, because ISE isn't saying the whole ACL to wireless LAN controller, just the name that the wireless LAN controller can use as a reference. And then we send that to guest portal. So there's no concept as redirect ACL for wireless LAN controller. Okay, and we create one more, and this is for the allowing internet on the wireless LAN controller. So we'll call it LM WLAN dash internet only. Again, instead of using downloadable ACL, we'll be using airspace ACL name. And this one is going to be referencing to LM internet only. Same thing, if you look through this, it's just match what we created with the downloadable ACL, DNS, DSCP, ISE, and then block everything to the private IP space. Okay, so we copy that, then save. Now that we have both conditions and results, I'm just going to go from top down. Let's go ahead and insert new rule above, and this one's going to be for once guest has successfully logged in, so we'll be matching identity group of guest. And for condition, just going to make sure its request is coming from a switch to identify the authentication as wired switch. And then for the authorization profile, that is wire internet only. Okay, let's duplicate below, and this one will be for a presenting a login page, so CWA. At that point, we have not determined its guest user yet, so any. We'll keep the switch, and we will be returning wire CWA. Okay, now we're going to do one for wireless, so let's duplicate below. And this one's going to be WLAN guest, user group guest, but for the device type this time, it will be the WLC here. And we also have WLAN internet only. So done. And then duplicate below. This is for CWA for wireless. So CWA device type it's going to become WLC, and again authorization profile will get changed to WLAN CWA. Done. Save. Okay, so that's pretty much it for all the configuration on ISE. Now we can move on to testing.